Today, I'd like to talk about environmental protection framework, talking about stewardship of significant resource values. I want to talk about two foci in this presentation. First of all will be concepts relating to the stewardship of resource value, and then I want to try to apply those ideas to specific resource values in the Lake Town Township study area, following some procedures and making some maps that are tied up in the exercise that you're going to be working on related to significant resource values in class. In defining stewardship of resource values, I want to spend some time defining the concept of resource value and resource use. I want to talk a little bit about defining rates of resource renewal, and then I want to talk about dilemmas of resource use. This is what I want to talk about in the first part of the presentation. That'll be followed up with an application to the study area for four types of resources, including prime agricultural land, aggregate mineral resources, that is, sand and gravel resources for construction purposes, recreational and open space resources, and then scenic resources. In terms of defining stewardship of significant resource values, I like to use a sociological definition of resource values that was coined by an economist, Erich Zimmerman, in 1933. Zimmerman suggested that, quote, resources are not, they become. And what he was getting at is that environmental entities exist when they assume utilitarian value and provide services to humans. They actually become resources. Technological advancement often leads to the definition of new resource values. A couple of examples of the influence of technology on resource definition. I'd like to talk about them because they give us a pretty good understanding of how technology can actually create natural resources. The first case is patronage on float trips through the Grand Canyon between 1867 and 1974. The table on the left-hand side of the screen shows patronage, number of trips floating on the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon of Arizona from 1867, when there was a grand total of one trip, through 1974, when there were 14,253 trips. Just for comparison, in 2017, there were 20,000 trips. There would be many more than that, but the National Park Service regulates the number of trips allowed through the Grand Canyon by a permit system. So we've had float trips going through the Grand Canyon since 1867, and there was a sudden surge in popularity from 120 in 1959 to 15,000 plus in 1974. Why was there this sudden surge in popularity of float trips through the Grand Canyon during this period of time? Among other reasons, and it's a pretty complex response, but among other reasons, there was the technological adaptation of inflatable rubber raft technology from World War II to river conditions that made floating the river a lot safer. Technology had transformed the treacherous water conditions into a tourism resource. You can see on the right-hand side of this image how they floated the river in the old days in wooden boats. And when you're floating the Colorado River in a wooden boat and you smash into a rock in the middle of the river, it's cookies. It's a disastrous circumstance. On the other hand, when you're in an inflatable rubber raft, as we see on the center image, you can bump into rocks and bounce right off of them. And the inflatable rubber rafts that you see here in the center image were developed in World War II for long distance air flights across the Pacific Ocean associated with World War II. And the rubber rafts then could be dropped out of the airplane. They could be inflated once they got into the water. And the rubber rafts provided instant flotation, but on the Colorado River, they make it possible to smash into rocks without causing significant damage to the vessel that's carrying you. So the technology then transformed the very treacherous water conditions of the Colorado River into a tourism resource. The second example is windsurfing at the Columbia River Gorge on the Columbia River in Oregon. The river runs parallel to a prevailing 40-mile-an-hour oceanic wind coming off of the ocean. And so this prevailing 40-mile-an-hour oceanic river runs parallel to the river orientation. The river, much of the river runs from southwest to northeast, which parallels the prevailing wind pattern. There is a dam in the river that you see in the lower left-hand corner, the Dells Dam, which creates a broadly elongated pool that runs parallel to the 40-mile-an-hour prevailing wind pattern. There are nearly vertical walls creating a virtual wind tunnel in the Columbia River Gorge. As a result, the wind is literally funneled through the Columbia River Gorge, and hence the 40-mile-an-hour wind is prevailing pretty much all of the time. For a long time, the 40-mile-an-hour wind was perceived by local residents as just a nuisance to be tolerated. It was there. It's windy. In Wood River, Oregon, it's windy in the Columbia River Gorge. Everybody knows that. It's just the way it is. But then a guy showed up with a gadget that affixed sailing technology to surfing technology and turned the nuisance into a resource that led to the creation of a recreation and tourism bonanza. The technological innovation of fixing sailing technology onto surfing technology created the windsurfer and transformed the ever-present and pesky wind into an environmental resource. The wind was always there. Through technological innovation, it became a recreational resource. Values can be defined from at least two different perspectives. On the one hand, we can talk about commodity values that are associated with the sale of the quantifiable services provided by the environmental entities in the marketplace. For example, we can talk about board feet of lumber derived from harvesting of standing timber. How much does a 2x4 by 16 cost? How much does a 2x6 by 12 cost? So we can quantify the value of the lumber and we can sell it in the marketplace. Bushels of corn produced from an acre of land. We can begin to quantify the value of a crop that is produced from land, and that transforms the land then into an economic resource. We can also talk about kilowatt hours of electricity that are generated by flowing water or blowing wind. In this case, we see a hydroelectric dam. The electricity that's generated by the hydroelectric dam can be placed on the grid and sold to consumers for a specific value. We can talk about barrels of oil that are pumped from a petroleum reserve. We can talk about swishing or skiing down the landforms at Afton Alps Ski Center on the St. Croix River, and talk about activity days and lift ticket sales as a way of quantifying the value that's derived, the commodity value that's derived from skiing at Afton Alps Ski Center. Here we're talking then about the lift ticket, the activity day value of the landform itself. The environmental entity is assuming economic value. We can also talk about another kind of resource called an amenity resource, which are associated with psychic gratification of using the environmental entity in a certain manner. These values are typically less quantifiable and not sold in the marketplace. For example, we can talk about the same Afton Alps Ski Center, for which we talked about commodity resource associated with lift tickets. Now we can talk about enjoying the scenic values of the Afton Alps Ski Center slopes while boating on the St. Croix River. We can talk about learning how iron ore was mined from the Iron Range in the early 20th century. We can talk about enjoying the psychic connection with an ancient ecosystem, for example, Muir Woods in the Mariposa Big Pines in California.